Now, Professor Dan Graham on The First Ethical Man, Reflections on the Life of Socrates and Why It Should Matter to Philosophers.
All right, thank you. Now I'm going to share my screen slide there. Are we good here? All right, thank you. So I'm going to read this through. I've timed it, it should be about right. And then of course, I welcome your questions about what I've talked about and what I haven't talked about as well. And I want to thank Don Morrison for this wonderful opportunity. I think it's fantastic to be able to get together in this time when it's so hard to meet with other scholars and feel like we see each other every couple of weeks and share ideas. I think it's fantastic. So thank you. Soon after the death of Socrates, some of his ardent followers gathered in the city of Megara next door to Athens as guests of Euclides. We don't know what happened there, but it may not be an accident that soon after the retreat, many of the Socratics began to publish Socraticoi logoi, inventing a new genre of writing and bringing their beloved master back to life. Socratic thought was not dead, but was experiencing a rebirth and pointing the discipline of philosophy in a new direction. From the Socratic movement, Plato would emerge as the leading spokesman, founding a permanent school of philosophy that would attract intellectuals from the Greek world, as well as Attic farmers and even curious women, we are told. By the end of the 4th century, Socrates had become a cultural icon, and the lectures of his followers were being attended by hundreds of eager citizens. We students of Socrates talk a lot about Socrates the philosopher, or more cautiously about Socrates the character in certain dialogues, especially those of Plato and Xenophon. But what about Socrates the historical figure? Thankfully, Professor Notomi raised the question at the beginning of this lecture series about Socrates' relationship to the sophistic movement of the second half of the 5th century BC. And that was followed up by Professor Barney recently. Let me raise the question in a broader context. What does the life of the historical Socrates matter to us who study him? Why should we care about his connections to the sophist, to the natural philosophers of his time, to the oracle at Delphi, to the establishment at Athens? Those stories are nice, we may say, but we are doing philosophical analysis. Let the historians worry about the flesh and blood Socrates. The problem, in part, is that historians who are wont to explain things in terms of social, political, and economic circumstances often fail miserably when they try to account for the idiosyncrasies and especially the intellectual project of someone who is completely unique and sui generis. But without some strong support from history, we're in the dark as to who the historical Socrates is, what he did, and ultimately, and most importantly, why he did it. There are, to be sure, those who think that Socrates and his story are such a muddle, so infused with legend, personal agendas of the Socratic authors, and literary embellishments or inventions, that Socrates comes to us as more of a myth than a man. There are also those who concede the historical figure is somehow behind the representations we get from our sources, but maintain that it behooves us to be agnostic, as one scholar says, about the historical Socrates. Finally, there are those enlightened people who think that we can reconstruct the views of historical Socrates from the sources, literary and historical, that we have. Thus looms the Socratic problem, the centuries-old debate that threatens to overwhelm our study before we get started. Now, get on the, okay, so we've got, here's where we're. So, why should we philosophers care? Why not just pick our favorite Socrates avatar from the Socratic literature and philosophize about it? For one thing, Socrates' way of pursuing knowledge is so highly personal, peculiar, idiosyncratic. He engages an individual who may be a casual acquaintance, a stranger, or boy in a conversation. He asks increasingly penetrating questions, which the interlocutor often doesn't understand initially, and then often dissects the answers of the interlocutor, revealing contradictions and confusions of his thought. Somehow Socrates claims to be looking for truth in this way, which he implies will provide not only understanding, but principles to live by. At times, Socrates claims that his activity of asking questions of others is an integral part of the good life, indeed the only kind of good life worth living. He also claims that accosting citizens and to ask them philosophical questions about virtue and goodness is beneficial for those citizens and will tend to make them better people. This is, at best, a very odd kind of philosophy. We need to be able to make sense of it, and it seems that the only way to do this is to put our Socrates avatars in a historical and biographical context in which it makes sense to pursue philosophy with strangers on street corners. But you may well object, all of this alleged evidence about Socrates is derived from literary sources, which portray a fictional character in fictional conversations written by Plato or Xenophon or Antisthenes or Aeschines or whoever. So why should anyone believe that the contents of the Socratic dialogues have any historical value? And further, that such history has any value for the understanding of philosophy? I will try to answer these questions here. Now, a little aside, I realize that I'm likely to be preaching to the choir here. Many of this group obviously take an interest in Socrates as a historical thinker, maybe not all. But there are still many students of Plato who think that the study of Socrates qua Socrates is a lost cause. I certainly have had my run-ins with them, and I suspect many of you have also. And it's them that I'm arguing with here. But in the process, even if you agree with me, the question still remains, how much can we get out of this project? All right, so let me turn to the point of who wrote the Socratic dialogues and when. It was Socrates' devoted followers who wrote them and flooded Athens with stories of Socrates' activities in the period immediately following the trial, condemnation, and execution of their beloved master. Moreover, Socrates was put to death not in spite of his philosophical activities, but arguably precisely because of them. He was targeted as an enemy of the state and taken down. Now, it's true that Socrates was officially charged with impiety and corrupting the youth by a relatively unknown private accuser, Miletus. Of course, that's how trials were done in Athens anyway, but by private citizens. But the fact that Anytus was on the prosecution team, Anytus, leader of the restored democracy, shows that this was no ordinary trial. Anytus was one of the champions of the amnesty that protected people who collaborated with the 30 from reprisals, and he did abide scrupulously by that agreement. But it didn't stop him from pursuing his political goals of ridding Athens of those he regarded as enemies of democracy by non-political means. It was he who insisted on the death penalty for Socrates. The historical context of the birth of Socratic literature makes it highly unlikely that the dialogues were meant as mere logical exercises, pleasant entertainment, or disinterested explorations. To provide a contemporary parallel, imagine that an author this year composes a play about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. Or imagine that an author composes a play about Martin Luther King Jr. in 1969, the year after his death. Will those compositions be taken as mere literary exercises, even if they might be intended by the author that way? Trace engaging in his idiosyncratic conversations in typical settings after 399 BC provided an intimate look at the real person written by his intimate associates. Every dialogue would then serve as an introduction to the man and his work. In the context of slanderous accounts of his activities, they would also serve as an apologia pro vita sua to a suspicious or hostile public. And each dialogue would function necessarily as a memorial to Socrates and a reminder of the signal injustice committed by the state against him. Hence, to portray Socrates sympathetically in Restoration Athens was to issue a political manifesto as well as a philosophical challenge to the establishment. There would be a historical reason for writing fictional dialogues. They would be representations of the type of conversations Socrates had, which were not recorded or given as formal orations, but which were ad lib interactions. Yet the dialogues would not serve their purposes if they misrepresented Socrates' beliefs, methods, beliefs, and practices. So here's a case where the right kind of historical fiction could provide a better insight into the life and thought of Socrates than a half-remembered memoir. If the dialogues are inventions, why is Socrates himself not an invention? And because the Socratic authors are using fictional means to reconstruct their non-fictional mentor, they aim to portray, to construct, to reconstruct, to resurrect their intellectual hero so as to share him with the world. It doesn't follow that they idealize him, though sometimes they do. But Plato, for instance, portrays Socrates committing a logical fallacy in his debate with Protagoras and has Protagoras catch him in the act. He has Socrates' friends express embarrassment at Socrates' fawning behavior before the sophistic lightweights in the Euthydemus. The dialogues depict a very human Socrates with foibles and failings, and one who is humble and self-effacing, but who is nonetheless highly competent in his investigations and unfailingly devoted in his quest for knowledge and virtue. And because they reveal a Socrates who is so engaging, they draw in the literary audience, as presumably the conversations themselves drew in those who overheard them, into the investigations themselves. The dialogues are what would come to be known as protreptic or motivational discussions. They tend to turn readers into philosophers, to convert them, as it were, to the philosophical life. This brings us to another dimension of Socratic dialogues, precisely because Socrates is not a dogmatic philosopher who expounds positions and deduces theorems and axioms. His questions are better known than his answers, and he remains an enigma even to his followers. So another purpose of a Socratic dialogue, a polemical and non-propagandistic one, is to try to make philosophical sense of an elusive thinker who never quite speaks for his own theory. What precisely is Socrates up to? Does he have a coherent theory, or is he a perpetual seeker after truth? Do his often paradoxical utterances have a resolution, or are they evidence of a thinker with more questions than answers? If we accept the historical story I've sketched here, the dialogues of the Socratics provide extensive evidence of Socrates. But as we get searching examinations of Socrates' methods and assumptions, we also observe competing representations of him. The Socratic movement was not a unitary propaganda machine. The individual Socratics presented their own versions of the master, and in time it seems the united front defending Socrates against the misconceptions of the people became a contest to see who could offer the most compelling portrayal of the master and his program. Here I would like to offer Socrates' life as a kind of datum that might help to answer some intellectual questions. We would need to appreciate what we can of his life, which is in part well-known, in part obscure. Thanks to the fuss Socrates stirred up, his life is one of the best known of ancient lives, and his character is far better known than that of any ancient figure. But there is a dearth of biographical studies. Now, I'm going to have a little discussion of this, which I will not read here, but there's a couple of early discussions here. And most of them are recent. The one thing, though, I will point out is none of them are really do what I would like to see done, and is often done with intellectual biographies of thinkers like Descartes, Hume, Kant, Wittgenstein, an attempt to connect the dots, connect the life with the thought. Most of these, not all, but most of these are written by non-philosophers and don't really have much chance of connecting up in the way one would like. I've pointed out that we have reliable or potentially reliable sources. Oh, let me just mention too, I don't have everything up here. For instance, Robin Waterfield's fine book on why Socrates died is certainly biographical, but it's a more focused study, not a general treatment, and that's what I'm looking for here. Okay, now, so I believe, so I've said, we have potentially reliable sources here. I believe that scholarly progress has been made in identifying Socrates' early dialogues as the best philosophical sources. I, like a number of you, as a student in one of Gregory Vlastos' summer seminars on Socrates, and I've been persuaded that his approach to Socrates was a fruitful one. I think that Xenophon also provides useful information, sometimes corroborating Plato's information, sometimes addressing aspects of Socrates' life that Plato was not interested in. The fact that different Socratics portray Socrates somewhat differently is not a scandal, but evidence for the independence of the sources. Aristotle distinguishes between Socratic and Platonic philosophy and uses early dialogues like the Protagoras as evidence for Socrates' philosophy. To be sure, we lack the quality and quantity of evidence researchers have for modern biographies. There are no meeting minutes, diary entries, private or public correspondence, newspaper articles, or unpublished manuscripts to go by. But we do get vignettes of the man from multiple sources over an extended period of time, and that's trust information of Plato with a little help from other Socratics and Aristotle, we should be able to. In the first place, Plato, and perhaps only Plato, has the philosophical acumen to appreciate the thought of Socrates, the subtleties of it. Since it appears that Plato himself argues against some Socratic principles in the middle period, as I think he does, for instance, in the Republic, we can distinguish between Plato's mature views and Socrates' views. In fact, I think there are places in the early dialogues where Plato lets the character Socrates express Socratic views and yet cast dramatic doubt on those views. And in saying this, I depart from Vlastos' claim that Plato can be trusted to echo Socrates only as long as he agrees with him. In any case, there are clear cases in which Socrates does things that we have reason to believe that Plato would never approve of. For instance, he asked non-philosophers for definitions of virtue. Plato thinks this is a waste of time, and it's likely he would always have thought this. Yet Plato seems to have admired Socrates' quest for virtue and wisdom, no matter how ill-prepared and ill-suited were his interlocutors. So I'm optimistic about the notion of studying Socrates, the flesh and blood citizen of Athens, as well as his thought as reported by some of his followers. And I think there's at least a fair chance of understanding both the man and his thought better by studying them together. In fact, I have been working on a pet project over a number of years, namely a philosophical biography of Socrates. Yes, I know it's crazy, and that's why I've been doing it quietly, but I'd like to tell you that it's about to be published, but alas, after having submitted it to a major press and having gone through the review process, including a revision to clarify methodology, and having had the readers and the philosophy editor sign off on it, it got rejected by the board for not being enthusiastic because some of the comments weren't enthusiastic enough. So back to the drawing board. But anyway, I would appreciate, anyway, hearing your thoughts about, whether this is worthwhile pursuing and in what form. So I can't expect this audience to pass judgment on the work itself, but I shall offer a few results from the study for your consideration with the hope of gaining helpful feedback from you. First, I'd like to offer some facts about Socrates' life, including some that are well known, some barely known, and some perhaps unknown, since my project includes new research on his life as well as his thought. And let me point out that by presenting these events as facts, I do not claim that they are indubitable or indisputable, just that the preponderance of historical evidence counts in their favor. And yes, I do believe in objective historical evidence, something I think we historians of philosophy must believe if we think the past is worth studying. So I will offer a number of facts. Now, actually, I'm going to kind of skip most of that, but I'll hit on a few things that I want to do. But these are in the slides. And again, there's a PDF handout of these that will, I'm going to mention a few things from this slide, and there's a couple of other slides. You're welcome to peruse those that I think constitute some high points of Socrates' life, things worth talking about, though I don't have time here. Our ultimate question is, how do we reconcile the idiosyncratic behavior, the curious life and paradoxical teachings of this individual? Okay, and here, there is solid evidence that in his youth, Socrates studied natural philosophy with Archelaus, the natural philosopher, and he accompanied his mentor to Samos. We're told by Ion of Chios, a good source, an early source who died in 421 around then. Why go to Samos? For the seafood, the obviously seems obvious to me, although nobody else seems to notice it, to meet the great philosopher of Samos, Melissus, the Eleatic. So it's likely that he met Melissus, Eleatic critic of natural philosophy, with a natural philosopher. Now, it would make a great Platonic dialogue, but apparently Plato doesn't know about this. I presume Plato knew him in the last 10 years of his life, and I presume Socrates didn't brag about his early life. It's quite possible he just didn't know. I speculate that Socrates was not impressed with the arguments his mentor could marshal against the Eleatic. Socrates grew up in the heyday of the sophistic movement, which on the positive side offered education in both theoretical and practical subjects to adults for the first time. He seems to have been genuinely impressed by the goal of some sophists to teach virtue and goodness, both in special fields and in general. Like some sophists, he seems to have decided that education should aim at practical improvement and not just theoretical expertise. There's evidence from Euripides that he came to his moral psychology and presumably his moral theory, at least by the early 420s, by the time he returned from his military service in Potidaea. Now, so moving on. A couple slides here. Now, with the sophists, ethical issues often took center stage. Some sophists promised to instill virtue in their students, while others called into question conventional moral standards. As yet, there was no widely accepted theory of ethics or approach to ethics, I suppose. And the sophistic emphasis on practical matters and polemical argumentation may have militated against an overly theoretical approach. Still, they claim to teach virtue and to make their students better, and ethical issues work central to many of their studies. Among natural philosophers, only Democritus, a contemporary of Socrates, had an extensive account of ethics, apparently, and his account tended to make ethics a matter of prudence rather than an autonomous discipline. Aristotle, in his schematic history of philosophy, or to be more precise, his review of the philosophical study of causes, tells us that Socrates, for the first time, turned the focus of philosophy to ethics and in particular definitions of ethical terms. In our last session, of this series, Professor Barney showed us some connections between the sophist dialectical practices and Socrates' electic method. Socrates, for his part, used the statements of his interlocutors as starting points for his investigations, which typically aim at clarifying the definition of some moral virtue. In the process, we often arrive at views Socrates seems to assert for himself. We see in various places in Plato's Socratic dialogues where Socrates holds to certain problematic or counterintuitive theses. Together, these seem to constitute a paradoxical set of principles. Here I lay out one subset of these, which I find central to his project. Okay. Virtue is knowledge. Point one. Point two, Socrates has no special, no expert, no scientific knowledge. He doesn't say, when he's careful, he doesn't say he has no knowledge, but he doesn't have any kind of expertise like the sophists claim. Point three, virtue is not teachable. Point four, Socrates' only method is a negative one of refutation, the elenchus. And five, Socrates is consistently virtuous in his behavior. At times, Socrates teases his interlocutors and us, the audience, with these paradoxes, as in the Protagoras with 1 and 3. He seems to hold them both. He regularly disavows special knowledge, such as the sophists profess, point 2, while emphasizing the limits of his philosophical method, point 4. Yet he also insists on his own moral rectitude, 5, most notably in Plato's Apology. And the study of his life, such as I am recommending here, tends to bear out this untypically self-assertive claims in that dialogue. What is remarkable is not just that he seems to do the right things in times of extreme moral conflict, as at the trial of the generals, the arrest warrant of the 30, and his own trial, but that he seems to reliably do the right thing always and everywhere. Is this the product of rationality, or a happy accident, or the result of some kind of divine gift? Whatever we think of points 1 to 4, we can never ignore point 5. What makes Socrates so virtuous? Okay, now I'll skip this again, but I just want to point out this is a big deal, because if you look for virtuous people, at least in Greek political history, it's pretty hard to find people who are consistently virtuous. A lot of them, we've got a bunch of traitors and turncoats and various sorts. As Plato himself points out in the Gorgias, it's hard to find a virtuous person in the life of Athens. But I won't belabor that. Yes, Socrates is virtuous, but how and why? There's a major divide among students of Socrates here. Some hold that Socrates asks all the right questions, but never arrives at adequate answers. The Socratic dialogues, after all, show him failing to arrive at satisfactory definitions and typically ending his sessions in aporia. When he arrives at provisional answers, such as his claim that virtue is knowledge, they seem to suggest further problems. If virtue is knowledge, how can it be teachable? If virtue is teachable, why do virtuous people fail to pass it on to their children? Plato himself seems to have a vested interest in stressing the aporetic Socrates, whose work needed to be eked out by a foundational epistemology relying on a secure metaphysics. Later, the new academy thought that the aporetic Socrates was just right. On the other hand, some students hold that Socrates has answers to all the troubling questions. Xenophon tends to represent Socrates in this way, as does Plato himself in the Gorgias, when he unmasked Socrates as the true statesman, the only practitioner of the politicae techne. Now, I hold to this view myself. I have a kind of a strong view about Socrates' knowledge. To see Socrates in action, let us turn to the Crito. Socrates' old friend Crito comes to visit him with news that through his generous gifts to the prison guards, he has paved the way for an escape from prison for Socrates. Socrates says he will go only if it is the right thing to do. Moral question. Is it right? How are they to decide this? By answering philosophical questions. Now, From the questions put first by Socrates and then by the personified laws of Athens, we learned that we must value living well more than just living. To do wrong causes one not to live well. Hence, to do wrong is bad for the doer. Hence, we must never do wrong. To injure is to do wrong. Hence, we must never injure. To violate agreements is to injure someone. Hence, we must never violate agreements. To break laws is to violate agreements. Hence, we must never break laws. To run away from legal punishment is to break laws. Hence, we must never run away from legal punishment. This argument is framed as an extended examination of the proposal that Socrates should break out of prison. The proposal is refuted. The result is negative, but it also tells Socrates positively what he should do, stay in prison. So it looks like we have, again, a logical direction of what to do, what to not do. A historical note here, since we're talking history as well. As strange as it sounds to us, breaking out of prison in Athens was not uncommon. The famous orator Demosthenes, for one, would do so in later years, presumably with a little help from the guards. Plato usually portrays Socrates investigating definitions of virtue. In the Crito, he portrays him in an act of ethical deliberation. He appeals to ethical principles to refute a proposed plan of action. Formally, the argument is a refutation, but it is the equivalent of a deduction of an action from general principles, not unlike a string of Aristotelian practical syllogisms. Socrates, this evidence shows, is moral by design, by theory, and by argument. I realize today that we have a tendency to view moral decision-making as a conundrum of trolley problems. Early in this series, one of my mentors, Paul Woodruff, spoke of the difficulty in resolving moral questions for Socrates. And I agreed with a lot of things he said, but I beg to differ on this point. I think that for Socrates, general moral principles, which there are general moral principles which entail less general theses. Okay? The principles are arrived at by a method of refuting all other proposed principles. These principles have application to specific situations. They're adequate to determine moral action, just as in the case of whether Socrates should break out of prison. And presumably in the case of whether the generals accused of dereliction of duty at Arginusae should be tried altogether, contrary to law. And in the case of whether he should arrest Leon Salamis on trumped-up charges in a situation where the defendant will presumably not even get a trial. Knowledge of these principles and their implications is provisional and requires constant reaffirmation, but that is possible through eclectic examinations. So we come back to these principles. Can we make sense of them? Well, here's a preliminary attempt. Socrates, point one, Socrates recognizes ethical principles, some of which he shares with Crito. Point two, ethical, excuse me, I'm not doing not there yet. These are general principles. He recognizes ethical principles. Ethical principles entail theses and, given circumstances of actions, correct moral actions. True theses can stand up to examination. False theses cannot. Critical examination, Alencus, reveals which theses are defensible and hence true. Knowledge of these theses is provisional and personal. Okay. It requires constant reaffirmation by the individual, hence the need for constant critical examination for the examined life. And hence the Alencus ends up being therapeutic for both parties involved here. Okay. Now, let's go back to the paradoxes a minute. Virtue is knowledge of what is good and what is evil. Point 2, Socrates has no special knowledge, but virtue doesn't require special or expert knowledge. Point 3, virtue is not teachable because we already know what is good and what is evil. Point 4, Socrates' only method is a negative one of refutation, true enough, but that is enough because it shows us what theses and what courses of action are defensible and what are not. Finally, Socrates is virtuous because he knows what is good and what is evil, and he knows that some of the things that tend to confuse us and contradict what we know, he's purged them out of him. He doesn't believe those things, okay? So, let's go on then to, let's turn to Plato's Apology at this point. Let's see, sorry, I gotta go back. Okay. There, Socrates says that he has discovered that he has one small advantage over the wise men of his day. They think they know things they do not know, while Socrates knows what he doesn't know. He uses this to act courageously. Quotation, to fear death, gentlemen, is no other than to think oneself wise when one is not, to think one knows what one does not know. No one knows whether death may not be one of the greatest of all blessings for a man, yet men fear it as if they knew that it is the greatest of evils. So he can say, next quote there, "You are wrong, sir, if you think that a man who is any good at all should take account of the risk of life or death. He should look to this only in his actions, whether what he is doing is right or wrong." So the agent's personal advantage, even survival, is irrelevant to moral questions. In contrast to the virtue of life or death, he observes, next quote, "I do know that it is wicked and shameful to do wrong, to disobey one's superior, be he God or man." It's something he knows. How does he know that? By philosophical arguments, surely, such as that in the Crito and Republic 1, where he does defend theses like this. Now, Socrates is a law-abiding citizen. In the trial of the generals, he insists on complying with the laws of Athens. When he's ordered to arrest Leon of Salamis, he refuses because the order is not based on a rule of law and justice. When he's put on trial for his life, he tells the jury that far from being an atheist, he is God's gift to Athens. When he is offered a plan to break out of prison, he refuses because this act would break laws. The only plausible explanation for his consistently virtuous behavior in the face of threats of his life and to his life and freedom is his sense of duty, based, according to those who knew him best, on philosophical principles. Socrates, the virtuous citizen, is a product of the ethical system he invented. So, who is the historical Socrates? Socrates is the man who, inspired by a new study of right and wrong, works out a code of conduct based on general, perhaps universal principles, practices applying them in every relevant situation, and lives in accordance with them. He learns to leave questions of his narrow self-interest and even his own survival out of account. He makes ethics into a sovereign discipline, answerable only to reason. There have been many moral people before him, those who accepted laws and teachings by faith or by custom. But Socrates, I think, develops a rational theory of ethics that has potential application to all situations in life. He makes it his own. He is the first ethical man in this narrow sense of, his ethical judgments are entailed by theoretical ethical position. That is what his followers see in him, an individual who seeks the good and right in some absolute sense in the light of a rational plan and lives accordingly. Both Plato and Xenophon, who share a good deal in common in their social backgrounds and in the association with Socrates, but who are hostile to each other personally, agree that Socrates is the most honest and upright man of his generation. That is one reason they bring him back to life, to show him as a paradigm as well as a gadfly. And it is one reason, at least, why Socrates' life will never be irrelevant to his thought. By their fruits ye shall know them. Socrates' life is the ultimate justification of his thought and the ultimate advertisement for his way of life. One last consideration. The story I've just told you is in one sense a very old one, going back arguably to Aristotle, but it's not for that reason outdated or obsolete. It is or should be a principle of the history of philosophy as well as of metaphysics that ex nihilo nihil fit. And no new ideas or theories arise that are not reactions to earlier ideas or theories. Without Socrates, the historical Socrates, Plato and his contemporaries in Athens make no historical sense. Out of the questions and concerns of sophistry, Socrates constructs ethics. Plato takes Socratic ethics and fits it out with a foundation of metaphysics and epistemology, applies it to political and educational literary theory, eventually even invents a natural philosophy grounded in ethical principles, and so on. How strange it is that Plato, in his massive literary output, almost never departs from the dialogue format of which his mentor was at home, and over a period of 50 years never speaks in his own voice, but puts his best insights into the mouth of the character Socrates, at least until near the end of his own life. Socrates, we may infer, is always the voice in Plato's head telling him how to do philosophy. Plato's oeuvre, as well as much of Xenophon's, is a tribute to Socrates, not a character invented by those authors and other Socratics, but the flesh and blood individual who made their thought possible and inspired their imitations, applications, and further development of that thought. That individual left an indelible mark on those who followed him. They redefined philosophy and recreated it in the image of Socrates. So, thank you. Let me unshare and you're muted, Donald.
I need to. You should, if you have a comment or question, you should please raise your hand using the raise your hand function. If you have trouble with that mode, you can send a chat or send me an email. I'm going to monitor those also. We have a question from Nick Smith.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Dan. That was really interesting. So I'm wondering about the way, this was toward the end of your paper. I don't have a slide in front of me, but hopefully others will remember it too, where you talk about, well, a virtue doesn't require knowledge, a special knowledge of any kind. And Socrates does have the relevant knowledge to be virtuous. That's how he becomes an exemplar and so on. And I'm just wondering if maybe our own sort of limited access to epistemic epistemic vocabulary is getting in the way here a little bit. So there's a two-part question. I wonder if maybe it wouldn't help to say that that you can be in a position where you can kind of distinguish right from wrong within reasonable levels of tolerance. But that's very different from the kind of knowledge that Socrates claims not to have, but then also invariably characterizes as what the kind of knowledge that virtue would consist in. And so what worried me about that particular solution to the problem was that it does seem as if Socrates can make moral judgments with a certain degree of confidence, but he consistently denies having the craft, the techne, that virtue would consist in. And so I'm wondering if it wouldn't make some sense to try to pull those apart, rather than simply deny the intellectualism and as you did, and say that, well, virtue doesn't require any special expertise.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Good point here. But yeah, I do want to say he does here, and I think it's to me, it's very telling in the Apology that he says he has knowledge of some things, like that it is wrong to disobey one's superiors. That he takes to be a point of knowledge, I take it, but not of a certain kind of, it apparently does not qualify as craft knowledge, but it does qualify as knowledge. I mean, this is kind of a Vlastos type answer where we have two senses of knowledge in play here. But I think that's, to my mind, the approach that seems to make sense here, that he thinks that he's got, again, there are ways of knowing these things. And I think, again, I don't think he thinks of this sort of certain moral truth as so much high level knowledge as very, something that is accessible to all of us, except that by taking on all these false beliefs from our environment, our, if you will, theoretical environment, we end up contradicting ourselves on these points.
William Altman.
Thanks, Don. Nick Smith wrote a really interesting paper that has the word hagiography in the title, in which he talks about a kind of inharmonious relationship between three fundamental aspects of Socrates, which are that he's an exemplar of virtue, that he believes that virtue is knowledge, and that he professes Socratic ignorance. I mean, I commend the paper to your attention. Nick, I think, also a participant in those Vlastos summer seminars, tends to try to finesse the ignorance among the three. In other words, to uphold virtue as knowledge and Socrates an exemplar of virtue, but to kind of finesse the limits of Socratic ignorance. And I felt that you were kind of doing the same thing. It's a very Aristotelian portrait, and as of course you made two admissions. In other words, that Aristotle's portrait is largely based on the Protagoras, and that in the Protagoras, as you acknowledged, that Socrates uses fallacious arguments and is called up on it. But we don't seem to call Aristotle out on the claim that Socrates regarded virtue as knowledge. So I want you to defend that claim a little bit further. I mean, I know it's a truism and that everybody believes it, but for example, you didn't mention in your paper the divine sign. I don't think Aristotle ever mentions it. He only mentions Socratic ignorance once. You did mention that, but I don't know if you gave it its full due. And that when you were talking about service to the god and quoting 29b, only in the last formulation did you talk about disobedience to his superiors. And of course, in that passage, what he says he knows is that to commit injustice and to be disobedient to one's better, whether man or God, is, I know that to be wrong. That I guess what I'm particularly interested in having you talk about is that you said near the end of your very interesting talk that the voice in Plato's head is Socrates, getting him, telling him how to do philosophy. And philosophy, it seems to me, is the real basis for reconsidering Socratic ignorance and reconsidering Aristotle's claim that Socrates simply regards virtue as knowledge. Because I think you'd agree that we're not going to get to understand what virtue is without philosophy. It's a philosophical enterprise, and your ethical Socrates is absolutely committed to that, as you brilliantly, I think, point out. But of course, the definition of philosophy that's given first in Symposium and then in Lysis is that it's metaxy. In other words, that it's got ignorance intrinsically built into it. It's between Sophia and Amathea, and that it's.
Excuse me, William, in the interest of giving other people
I think
a type of discussion, if we could.
I guess I'd like you to, discuss the definition of philosophy in terms of the possible rehabilitation of Socratic ignorance as opposed to virtuous knowledge.
Very interesting discussion here. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, you mentioned, among other things, Symposium there and so forth. I'm not sure we get a definition, to my mind, of philosophy in the Socratic dialogue so much. But I do think that, again, I do think that Socrates, the one thing I would stress here that we haven't brought in too much is that I think for him, it's all about having the right beliefs. To him, here I know there are some things that Nick has written that I'm not going along with here, because I don't see him as having a big role for instance, things like having passion or emotion play a big role in moral action, or even in non-moral action. It's a case of if you have the right beliefs, everything else is going to follow. That means that in some sense, we're going to be dealing with some kind of intellectualism, some kind of having the right beliefs, orthodoxy in some sense or other is going to be the key toward doing the right thing, which is very different from our sort of post-Humean way of thinking about these things today. And so he does, I think, believe that our having the right belief about what is right and wrong is absolutely essential. I think he thinks we all have that. And the difference is that some people mess it up by starting believing things like death is the greatest of all evils. And when you start believing that, then you have a conflict between what is the worst evil. Is it immorality or is it death? And then you start doing the wrong things and being unvirtuous. And so you have to somehow get rid of those false beliefs.
All right. I think I'll permit myself to slide in with just something short. You say that personal welfare is irrelevant, and this is for Socrates, when we're deliberating about, haven't written it all exactly down, but when we're deliberating about moral circumstances. And I wanted to ask you what you mean by moral there, and where's the role of knowledge and deliberation about prudence and one's own welfare in your Socrates? Is he looking for knowledge about how to make your own life better and how to tell other people to do it?
I don't see a lot of that. And of course, we do get some of that in Xenophon, and there's a little, for instance, Gorgias has some room for that, I think. But I do think that for him, until you have answered the moral question, is this the right action or something, other things don't come to be relevant. You don't. If let's say if there's no moral objection to my, for instance, should I take this job or that job? If I have job offers, one of which is, both of which are, say, with moral companies, I could choose either one, and I might choose one of them on the basis of getting paid better. But if I discover that one of these companies is engaged in all kinds of immoral practices and so forth, then I can't even ask that question, how could I benefit financially and so forth. So my thought, again, is at least a hierarchy here, which the moral is always the first consideration. If you can pass that on, then you can talk about prudence. But I don't see him justifying morality on the basis of prudence. I see him, leaving that aside until the moral question questions get answered. As Vlastos calls it, the sovereignty of virtue is here.
All right. For our next question, we've got something in the chat. Everyone should be able to see it, from Glenn Ross. And in connection with Nick Smith's question, your Socratic paradoxes revisited, you state that according to Socrates, virtue isn't teachable because we already know what good and evil are. Could you say something more about that point?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do think that, again, I think for one thing, there's never a case where I think he assumes that he has to tell you what the right thing is to do. I think he is always thinking he has to unteach you some false belief like death is the greatest of all evils. Now, there are times when he, for instance, I think, again, both in the Crito and in Republic Book 1, where he does defend a kind of general position about it is never right to do wrong, kind of thing. Now, again, but he can say, he does talk about injustice. He does sort of explicate that in terms of saying that it would be somehow contradictory for me to try to make someone, do someone wrong, Republic 1, do wrong to somebody else, which if there is real wrongdoing, it would amount to making somebody more unjust. And if I made somebody more unjust, I would make that person worse. And by making somebody worse, I would somehow, justice would be doing something unjust. There is a kind of craft thinking there about somehow justice tends to produce more justice. But I do think that he thinks that when we are just, we tend to make other people more just. And in a sense, we make them good. And now he doesn't, I mean, in some ways it would be nice if he had a basic account of what goodness is. I think that's the one place where the question is whether we can get away with, we need an independent account of goodness that's independent of virtue and so on. And is it circular? Plato criticizes him for this in Republic Book 6. He doesn't think he has an independent account of the good to support this. I think his own answer would be that he has that, in a sense, we all know what goodness is. And things like treating people fairly are just self-evidently good and so forth. And they are just to that extent. But he does not, it is an interesting question because he doesn't seem to focus, he doesn't seem to address the question by itself of how do we know the basic principles of goodness. He has an eclectic way of refuting the wrong ones, but not of identifying the true. And the true principle is the one that survives refutation.
Okay, Sandra Peterson.
Thanks for your talk. My question is, You said at one point that the elenchus is therapeutic for both the parties involved. And I'm wondering if you could say how it's therapeutic for the questioner.
Well, yeah. Now I'm thinking of, I mean, he actually says this in one passage in the Gorgias. He tells, what is it? Polus, I think, but I'd have to look it up. He says, submit to my questions as to a doctor. This is good for you. And he's being, at this point, sulking and, resisting the obvious elected questions and so forth. But he actually makes that claim there, that there's something therapeutic about this for the answer. But the other side of this, I think, is that his claim, again, has to be, this is how I see him, that he thinks that you have to ask the questions, what's right and wrong every day. He says that in the Apology. You have to ask them every day because I think his point is that there are always false beliefs that are being promoted and passed around. And if you're not careful, you'll start believing that like death is the greatest of all evils. It's not that anybody teaches that so much as the way they, gets in indirectly, perhaps, into our belief system. But when it does, it messes up our correct belief that the worst thing that's possible is to do wrong, to do moral injustice or something like that. And so I need to be reminded every day of what's really important. And the only way I can do that is by making sure what I do. In fact, again, the sense in which I'm learning with you when I ask you these questions, because I need to reaffirm them. There's something inductive about our way of arriving at truth, kind of moral induction here.
Yeah, okay. At first, I thought you were just telling me how the answerer is to be treated therapeutically, but now I see the questioner gets it also.
Yeah. Yes. You need to have it reinforced by, reinforced by refuting those false views and verifying their truth. Again, he seems to have an almost inductive view. Again, I take it in some sense he has a fallibilist view about epistemology. Again, not that he has a formal epistemology, but he thinks that all knowledge is fallible, but the only way you can be sure of it is by reaffirming it all the time. Okay, I think you're muted again, Donald. Donald, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I'm just too self-effacing. Katerina Lefka.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I would like to follow the same line as Nicholas Smith and Glenn Rosen. I still find it very difficult to adhere to that kind of contradiction for me. Socrates dedicated his life to the research of the truth by dialectics, to the truth about moral issues, about the good, about the virtues. And in the Apology, he says that this was the best thing that he could do. It was even a divine mission, and it was the best thing that would happen to the city of Athens. At the same time, Plato later called the idea of the good the highest lesson, and the possibility to understand it the most difficult among all. It seems to me very difficult to combine this with the idea that no specialized knowledge was necessary to understand what was good or bad, because precisely the whole philosophy of Socrates has that aim to understand that, or to make others understand it. It's another way of teaching, perhaps, not just giving the answer to the others, but helping them to find it by themselves. But however, it needed a very specialized work to arrive to there. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I would say, I think Socrates is certainly in some sense he's teaching. I don't dispute that at all. But I think what he's doing is not conventional teaching. He's not lecturing. He's not saying this is moral principle A, this is moral principle B, this is a situation, this is how we apply it. This is what you do. I think he thinks that, well, let me add something else about the therapeutic stuff here, that the way I see him, it's not unlike what happens in psychoanalytic theory. If you believe that trauma, your your psychological problems are caused by childhood traumas, fairly easily, at some point, the therapist could tell you what trauma you had and what effects it had, but that won't do you any good. You've got to figure it out for yourself. And so as a therapist, I ask you, what about this? What about this? And suddenly you come to a realization that, oh, that's what's my problem is. And so I think he's like that he thinks that I could tell you what the right principles are and what you should do, but it wouldn't do you any good. You have to figure it out. And that involves having to recognize the false beliefs you have, get rid of them, and then realize that the most important thing here is to be a good person, to help other people, to promote justice and goodness, etc. And so there's a certain sense in which, yes, he's certainly making the world a better place, but he's not doing it by lecturing. And the only way he thinks is by a kind of therapeutic method of the sort he promises in the Gorgias. He says, this is good for you and it will help you, and I will learn along with you in that process. Now, I'm not sure if I answered all of the question, but that's part of it anyway, I think, what I heard.
All right. I have a question that has come to me via email from Lindsay Wheeler. I'm going to condense a little. I.F. Stone, in his book, The Trial of Socrates, mentions that Aristophanes, an outside witness from Plato, called Socrates Sparta mad. And there's other evidence of Socrates' admiration for Crete and Sparta. Do you think Aristophanes is a good witness to what and who Socrates was? And was Socrates a laconophile?
I do think there's some evidence that he admired, yes, he admired the discipline of Sparta. And I guess the one question is he in favor of oligarchy or that kind of thing? Does he approve of that? I mean, it's a bit hard to tell. I think he admired aspects of the Spartan life. I don't think he was crazy about Sparta. He certainly lived a rather, he was capable of kind of an ascetic lifestyle like some of the Spartans were. And I think he admired their self-discipline. But I'm not sure that he's a fan of the Spartan constitution. I do think that he seems to have, he certainly upheld the you might say the Athenian constitution at the trial of the generals when he was in charge. And I think he was supporting the laws and resisting attempts to bypass the Athenian laws there. And I think it's likely that he, again, didn't think that democracy as it was practiced in Athens was a very good way, for reasons like you see in the trial of the generals. There weren't enough checks and balances in that democracy. And so I think he was critical of the Athenian democracy, but not subversive towards it. He certainly supports it to the best of his ability in that way.
Sarah, you've put up something to download. You might explain to everyone. You might explain to us what that is. Sarah Brody?
She's muted.
Yes, sorry, Dan and everyone, but that was a mistake. I was sort of fiddling a little bit, and
Oh,
it,
I
it
thought
just,
you were
I
telling
mean,
us you'd give the
you're
talk on this
welcome to
point to the
read it, but yeah,
Alchemist. Sorry.
yeah.
All right. Leslie Dean Jones.
The comment you made that one of the things Socrates has to do is to unteach people some thoughts. When the interlocutor is somebody like Callicles, who's holding that the interest is that of the stronger, and that makes sense. But for instance, when he's talking to an interlocutor like Laches, who begins with a point of view that isn't in and of itself wrong, that in the line of battle, you shouldn't run away, you should stand by your compatriots, etc. Why does Socrates begin with acting as if that's wrong, rather, if it's true that we know what is good and bad, why does he not begin with, well, that's right in that situation. Now, what's right about that thought that we can put somewhere else, instead of the Elenchus, where he thinks up all the occasions when that wouldn't be the right thing to do. So it seems to be trying to unteach Laches rather than taking something that Laches knows and using that to translating that to other situations, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with that. And I do think, I mean, it's very deeply embedded in his method that he tends to use that negative approach to everybody. But I think, again, I think I would go back again to the therapeutic bit. I can tell you, but it won't help you. You need to sort of appreciate the situation for yourself to see where you're getting this, cognitive dissonance from, and where you're getting conflict from, and see this sort of situation. So he's very good at getting people to react to the to evaluate and think through problems and so forth. And I don't think he typically does, give you he doesn't use sort of a positive approach to say, well, you believe. He will sometimes use a positive belief of yours to deduce another belief, but often it's to show you that this other belief conflicts with the first belief. And so it is a via negativa most of the time that he's using there. And I don't think he thinks that the way to understand what's right and wrong is to just acknowledge it publicly. It's to realize, to show you how the other views are untenable, indefensible.
But if as a virtuous man, what we see, why we know Socrates is virtuous is through his actions. Why don't we know that Laches and Nicias are brave through their actions?
That's a really good question. I think, and I mean, speculate here a bit, but I mean, remember the history about Nicias. I mean, this is being written, ex post facto, obviously, and so we have options for dramatic irony here. But we know he failed badly and spectacularly in the Syracuse campaign. And now, it's not that he wasn't a decent soldier, but he certainly, Thucydides himself points out some knowledge failures on the part of Nicias there. And I'm not sure to what extent we're supposed to bring that along with us, but I do think that the fact that he picked somebody like Nicias may not be an accident there. The idea being, I think both of them Laches, Nicias suffered defeats, and in the long run, they weren't the people you would say were the greatest military successes out there for sure. And of course, that again, there's a kind of issue here between, are we talking about moral virtue or military prowess here, which is another problem, how to sort all that out. But I do think that it's possible, at least, that Nicias is not being brought on as an example of the greatest general that one could have.
Okay, Dan, I'm going to let myself make a quick provocative comment, see how you react. You said that Plato probably was the only one of the Socratics who was brilliant enough philosophically to understand Socrates in its fullness, Socrates' philosophical points. There's a different view one could take, namely Plato was so brilliant and so creative that it's doubtful that the historical Socrates was anything like as brilliant and clear as the Socrates in Plato's dialogues, right? Could the brilliant Plato have held himself back to be as dumb as the historical Socrates rather than putting his own brilliance into it? What do you think about that historical provocation?
Yeah, well, it's, thanks for bringing that up. It's an interesting challenge. But again, I see him again because of the way he, of course, does his middle dialogues and late dialogues. You see him actually interacting with Socratic stuff later on. For instance, talking about the Alencus in the Sophist, Socratic Alencus, talking about knowledge is virtue in Book 6 of the Republic and so forth, and disagreeing with that position. And also, and I think, so first thing is I think he sees him not only as an inspiration, but as a kind of, at times, as a kind of interlocutor with Plato himself. I mean, I've got to argue with these Socratic ideas to move philosophy along here, etc. But I think also, again, I'm going to go back to the points I made earlier. I can never imagine Plato going up to some citizen on the street and saying, "What do you think about virtue?" Plato is everywhere where you see him, I think, like in the Republic. He deeply despises the many. His comments on democracy and other things, and talking about in the Gorgias and the Republic about what he thinks about the craftsman in general. In some ways, he admires the craft analogy, but he thinks of craftsmen as, very low-life people and so forth. You wouldn't want to marry into that family kind of things. He's a snob. He's very un-Socratic in his own attitude. And Socrates' theory depends on talking to ordinary people. It doesn't work any other way. So I think there's a sort of tension in Aristotle.
Let's see. William Altman, we've got maybe time for one quick last question.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on on Leslie Dean Jones's excellent point about the Laches. First of all, it's not about Nicias, her point. Her point is about Laches, and it's about standing in the position in which you've been assigned. And it's a particularly pertinent question, especially because of the text you emphasized in the Apology at 29b, where Socrates takes a completely Lachian approach to the decision, which again you emphasized in proving that Socrates is an ethical man of staying in the jail cell. He stays in the position in which his betters have assigned him, just as he did at the battle line and Amphipolis and Delium. And so Leslie's point really needs to be addressed in a more thoughtful way, that he is really calling into question not only a plausible view on the basis of the laches, but a view that he himself, the maxim of the action of which he himself will follow in the Apology and in the Crito.
Yeah, well, good. Okay, thank you for amplifying that. It's helpful. Again, so let me go back to this. I mean, this isn't very original with me, but I do think that it is true that Socrates doesn't like, when he's looking for a definition of virtue, he doesn't like behavioral definitions like virtue consists of this action. He wants something that's more comprehensive, that will fit not only one situation, but all situations. And he does seem to think that behavioral type definitions aren't going to work. You need something more comprehensive. And I do think, I mean, again, some people say, well, he never gets an adequate definition. My answer is he does accept, as in the Protagoras, the claim that virtue is knowledge, and that since all the virtues are one, which he also holds in the Protagoras, that the correct definition is going to be virtue is knowledge. Now that doesn't tell what's wrong necessarily with that definition, but it does tell, well, it doesn't tell you, but what it does tell you though is in his mind what's too narrow about it, that it's too situation specific. We need something that will account not only for what the Athenians do in certain situations, but what the Spartans did at the Battle of Plataea, where they pretended they were running away and then turned around, wheeled around and reattacked. That was a courageous action too. And you need to be able to cover all of those things, not just a subset of them. And so the problem there is the narrowness of that particular one.
My point was obviously that's where Socrates goes. But my point originated with your comment that Socrates had to unteach people what they thought. And I don't see what he had to unteach laches about. I mean, laches knew at least one form of bravery, one form of the good. And it's a form which showed that he didn't think of death as the greatest evil. So it wasn't that Socrates really needed to unteach that. He needed to amplify it, to expand it to other situations. So that was my question.
Okay.
Of course, I know it's that Socrates' view was it was too narrow a definition, but I didn't see what was wrong about it and why it meant that laches was not a brave person.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, probably not every problem needs to be, is a matter of unteaching. In some cases, it's a matter of broadening your database here so you make sure your definition is universally applicable. And that's a common problem with interlocutors, of course. In fact, just learning that that's what the game is all about governs a lot of the beginning of a lot of dialogues.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker for a provocative and interesting talk. And we've had a lively enough discussion that there's been side discussion in the chat. So it's all very good. And I'll applaud on behalf of all the muted participants. As I said at the beginning, there will not be a colloquium 2 weeks from now, but there will be one 4 weeks from now, and I hope to see all of you there if you can make it.